the Tutti English first additional language lessons, guys. I hope that you have been sharpening those language skills. Remember, central to the 3 papers is the knowledge and in-depth knowledge, for that matter, of the dynamics of language, that which will assist you to also respond to questions based on literature in paper 2, as well as to write creatively in paper 3. So it's very, very important that we don't neglect language dynamics. Now we are going to go into question 5 of English FAL paper 1. We know that paper 1 is comprehension, summary, advert, cartoon, and the language section, that which is troublesome to a number of candidates, but I'll definitely make sure that I simplify the language concepts for you guys. Remember, the goal is for us to obtain distinctions in English, and it is achievable and doable. Without any waste of time, before we can even delve deeper into the nitty-gritties of this lesson, it's important that you revisit the previous lesson that was simply based on identification of subject, verb, and an object, because for you to change now sentences from active to passive voice, we are going to rely a lot on firstly knowing what we mean by a subject in a sentence, what we mean by a verb, as well as what we mean by an object. Just to give you guys a brief recap on our previous lesson, please revisit that lesson before you can even actually view this one. A subject is going to be anything or anyone that performs the action in a sentence. The verb is the doing word, and whatever that is acted upon or affected by the action of the verb, we note that as is our object. Now today we are learning how to change sentences from active to passive voice. First and foremost, we need to establish as to what we mean when you say that the sentence in English is in an active voice, or a sentence in English is actually in a passive voice. Now, in an active voice, we've got the subject of the sentence that is performing the action. For example, here, let us have a very quick example. I can say, Lesego cooked lunch. It's a very basic, simple sentence, right? And then we've got Lesego as the subject performing the action. The action that she actually performed was to cook. There's a verb, and then what is that? She has cooked lunch, and then lunch becomes the object. So there's a first rule that you need to know first before you can even learn how to change sentences from active to passive voice. And then now this sentence is in an active voice because we've got the subject that is performing the action. Now if we were to convert the very same sentence from active to passive voice, you now take the object of the sentence to become the subject of the sentence, and it does what? It does the work. So it means that in a nutshell, in a passive voice, the subject of a sentence receives the action of the verb. It means that the object becomes the subject, and it does what? It does perform what? The action. Now, as I've already alluded in the beginning of the lesson, that the first thing that you need to know is to establish or distinguish what we mean by subject, verb, and an object, that which we have done in our previous lesson. And then now the main role now, or if not the main important idea that or skill that you need to learn, is that here now we are going to learn on the roles of various tenses, because for us to know the correct auxiliary verb to use in a passive voice, we are going to rely on we are going to be directed by the tense of the sentence. Now what we are going to do, we are going to have the same sentence in different tenses, so that we know which auxiliary verbs to use when changing sentences from active to passive voice, and the auxiliary verbs that we use are going to be determined by the tense of the sentence. Okay, let us start with our sentence A and sentence B. Both sentences are the same. The only difference is that the tense is different. We've got the first one: people generate a lot of money from blocking. Now when I assess the sentence, I check the tense. Okay, who's performing the action here? We've got people. This is our subject. What are they doing? They generate, and then this is our verb. The question would be, therefore, what are they generating? They are generating a lot of money. So now a lot of money becomes our object. Now the sentence A, it's in an active voice. We have to take it now into a passive voice. Remember what we said? In an active voice, the subject will perform the action. In a passive voice, now we start with an object, because we take the object to become the subject of the sentence, and it does perform the action. Now after establishing our object, that which we are going to use to formulate a passive voice, you don't just rush to formulate a passive voice, you determine the tense. So if this sentence, the tense is generate, so when you generate, it means this is something that is happening currently, so I can safely say that this is a present tense. Now with regard to a present tense, I'm expecting you to use auxiliary verbs, either the word is or are, because they are auxiliary verbs in a present tense. Depending if maybe the object is in a plural form, would use are. If the object is in a singular form, would use what is. Now by virtue of having a determiner here, which is a, the determiner a, it means a singular, so I'm expecting you to use is because it means one. So here is our object. We are going to start now. Here we are having our passive voice. Once you start with an object, the voice changes from active to passive. So a lot of money is generated from blogging by a lot of people. Now why are we using auxiliary verb is here? Remember, we are changing a present tense, so is indicate or represent, or rather show that we were changing a present tense. However, the verb in a passive voice will always go into a past tense, so the verb is affected to say generated. However, the auxiliary verb is there to indicate that the active voice that we are changing was actually in a present tense. Let us move along to the second sentence B. People generated a lot of money from blogging. The difference between this sentence and this sentence, here we say generate, and then here we say generated. So it means that sentence B is in a past tense. Sentence B is in a past tense. And then we know that people is our subject, generated is our verb, and then we already know that a lot of money is our object. And remember that in a passive voice, what are we going to start with? We start with our object. Now we are going to say a lot of money was. Why do we say was here? Remember, we are changing a past tense, so I'm expecting your auxiliary verb to be was or to be were, depending if it's a singular or in a plural form. So because we said the article a indicate one, it means that we are going to say, remember, in essence, there must be the concord must be correct. The sentence must retain meaning. That is why it's always important to read it out, so that you can verify if the words agree, and that we call subject verb agreement. We call it concord in English. So here we say a lot of money was generated from blogging by a lot of people. The two sentences are the same. The only difference is that here we use the word is to show that we are changing a present tense, and here the auxiliary verb was to indicate that we are changing what? A past tense. But the common thread is that generated. It means that across all the tenses, the verb will always go into a past tense. The only difference, it will be the fact that auxiliary verbs will never be the same, depending on, or they will be affected by the nature of the verb. Correct. Now let us move along. We check the present tense, we check the past tense. Now sentence C, people are generating. This one now, again, it's also unique in a sense that you also note the tense that we are going to use. Here, people are generating, the verb or the suffix of the verb ends with ing. This is what you call the present progressive. If you don't want to call it present progressive, you can call it present continuous tense, right? It means that action is still continuing. So here we already know this is our subject, generating becomes our verb, and then we know that automatically a lot of money becomes our object, like we have done in the previous sentences. Now the question is, here is a tense that is unique. What kind of an auxiliary verb is it expected to be used here? Is a present continuous tense. That's where now we are going to add the word plus being. You are only going to add the word plus being, provided you are changing a sentence that is in a present progressive or a present continuous tense. Okay, now it's either you are going to say is being, or are being, or were being, or was being, depending on the sentence. So this is not a past continuous tense, but it's a present continuous tense. So we are going to have a lot of money is being generated. Why are we having is being? Remember, we have added auxiliary verb is being because we are changing what? A present continuous tense. All right, and then the verb ultimately went into a past tense like we did in the two tenses. Now sentence D, people will generate a lot of money from blogging. Remember, this sentence is the same. The only difference is that we are playing around with the various tenses so that we check which auxiliary verbs to use. People, we know that this is our subject. Now let us check the tense. It says will generate. Will, it means something that will happen in the future, so that means that the sentence is in the future tense. Okay, it's in the future tense, and then we know that a lot of money actually is our object. A lot of money is our object. Right, now perfect. Now if you have a future tense, the question will be then, which auxiliary verb are we going to use in the passive voice? We are just going to add will, then we say plus be. So object, we start with it. Remember, we start with the object. A lot of money will be. Why here do we say will be? Remember, it is because now we are changing what? A future tense, and then the verb remains the same, like it remained the same in the present continuous tense. Present continuous tense, it remained this. It changed again into generated. So the same way that we did with present tense and past tense, we are going to do the same with present continuous tense and future tense. The two sentences are the same. The only difference is that here we use the auxiliary verb is being to indicate that we are changing what? A present continuous tense. And then here we have used the will be to indicate that we are actually changing what? A future tense. Now what about in sentences where we have either the present perfect tense or the past perfect tense? Remember, for you to determine the perfect tenses, it's either the sentence will use has or the sentence will use have, which we call them present perfect tense, or the sentence will use the had. If they change that to become had, then you know that this is a past perfect tense. Right, now this one says people have generated a lot of money. Already we know our object is a lot of money, and then we know in a passive voice we begin with the object, so we are going to say a lot of money. So what will be the auxiliary verb in instances where we are talking about perfect tenses? It's either we are going to add the word plus been, so it's going to be either a lot of money have been generated from gambling by a lot of people. Sorry, not a lot of money has, not have. Has, let us correct grammar. Words do not agree. A lot of money has been generated from gambling by a lot of people. So here, let us repeat. We added is being, provided the sentence ends with what? ing to show it's a present tense. We add will be if it's a future tense, and then we definitely add plus been, whether is it a present or a past perfect tense. So we use the same sentence. The only difference is that the auxiliary verbs are not the same. They are affected by the nature of the tense itself. So it means that you need to divide the sentence into subject, verb, and object. Allocate yourself, determine the correct object. You start with the object, but before you can even write your sentence, you check what is the tense so that you can determine the correct auxiliary verb to use. And then now we also need to look at the pronouns. How do the pronouns change, and how are the pronouns affected, and how we should use pronouns when we are changing voices from active to passive voice. And what is important, I'll repeat, is concord. After changing, read the sentence out. If the words don't agree, you know that you've got grammar issues, then we've got concord errors because the words do not agree. So in an active voice, for example, you can have she loves her daughter. Who's performing the action here is the pronoun she. This is our subject, and then the action that is performing is to love, and then who does she love is going to be who? Her daughter. So her daughter becomes what? Your object. And of course in a passive voice now you begin with the object, so you can't, it's going to be her daughter is loved. You can't say by she. That she changes now to become what? She is loved by her. That is how you change the pronoun in sentences of this nature. And then again, now we can have another example. Sam teaches me Hindu, and then we've got Sam who's performing the action, subject. The action that he's performing here is to teach. which becomes the verb. Now, if you can remember, in our previous lesson, I did mention that there are unique sentences where you can find having more two objects. Like where, for example, I can say, who does he teach? We are going to say me, and then again, what is he teaching? Hindi. So me becomes your direct object, and then Hindi becomes your indirect object. So in instances where you may come across sentences of this nature, please consider the first one as your direct object. But then you cannot start your sentence grammatically saying me. So that me is going to change into the first personal pronoun I. It's going to be I am taught Hindi by se. All right. Now, in essence, present, if you are changing a present tense from active to passive voice, it's either you are going to use auxiliary verbs is or are plus the verb. If you are using past tense, if you are changing past tense, converting past tense, it's either you are going to use was or were plus the verb. That will always go into a past tense, remember that. And then if you are changing a present continuous tense or present progressive tense, that is where you are going to add the word being. It might be was being if it was a perfect progressive, or are being if it's a present was being if it was a past progressive or past continuous, or are being if it's a present continuous. And then for future you add the word be. And then for perfect tenses such as have, has, or had, you are just going to add the auxiliary verb being. So it is important to determine the object. After determining the object, you check the tense. After determining the tense, you then assess which of the auxiliary verbs are going to be used to change active from passive, that which are affected by the tense. That is how you change sentences from active to passive voice, remembering that in an active voice the subject performs the action. In a passive voice, you take the object of the sentence to become the subject, and then it does what? It performs the action. And then what is important after locating an object is to pause and study, if not assess, the tense of the sentence, so that you know from all these lists that we have done which are the best suitable auxiliary verbs to use that are actually correlate with the tense in order for a sentence to retain meaning. Remember, in question 5, paper 1, examiners definitely will ask you to change sentences from active to passive. Thank you.